The city woke up early every morning, and so did he. He never needed an alarm clock or a reminder. The noise of engines starting, people hurrying down the sidewalk, and the faint smell of freshly baked bread from the nearby bakery were enough to tell him a new day had begun. He sat on the same corner of the street every day, leaning against a wall with his old jacket wrapped around him. His hair was a little messy, his shoes were worn out, and his hands had a few scars from years of living rough. People passed by, but no one ever really saw him. To them, he was just another man on the street, someone to avoid, someone to ignore. He watched people rushing to work with their coffee cups in one hand and phones in the other. Some walked so fast they didn't even notice when the cold wind pushed against their coats. A few glanced his way, then quickly looked somewhere else, as if just making eye contact would be a burden. Some whispered to each other as they passed. Others crossed the street before reaching his corner. He had learned to live with that silence, the kind of silence that isn't quiet at all. It's full of people pretending not to hear you. But he wasn't always invisible. There was a time when he had a small place of his own. A warm bed. A job he was proud of. A reason to get up each morning. Life doesn't always break in one big moment. Sometimes it happens little by little. A mistake, a stroke of bad luck, a door closing that you thought would always stay open. Years ago, that's how his life changed. He lost his job, then his home, then the people he thought would be there. Soon the streets became the only place left. He learned how to survive quietly. He never begged too loudly, never bothered anyone. If someone dropped a few coins in his cup, he gave a small nod to say thank you. If they didn't, he said nothing at all. Over time, people stopped looking at him altogether. They saw a man sitting with an old blanket, not the person underneath it. Every day he saw faces come and go. He knew the rhythm of the city better than most. He could tell who worked nearby by how they walked. He could tell who was having a bad day by how their shoulders drooped. He noticed things no one else paid attention to, because when you're ignored long enough, you learn to observe everything. Across the street, tall buildings rose high, with shiny windows and guards standing at the entrance. One of the buildings belonged to a powerful businessman. He didn't know much about the man, but he saw his black car every morning and evening. The car would pull up to the front gate, the guard would open the door, and a young woman would step out. She always had a calm look on her face, like she was used to a life where everything happened on time. She wore expensive clothes and held her head high. Sometimes she would glance out of the window when the car passed him, but her eyes never stayed long enough to really see him. She wasn't cruel. She just lived in a different world. The man on the corner often wondered how it felt to live a life like hers. Warm meals, a soft bed, a door that locked at night. But he never let that thought stay too long. It hurt more when you held on to it. Instead, he focused on simple things. A warm cup of tea when someone was kind, a few dry crackers, a quiet night without rain. The people who walked by him every day made their own stories in their heads. Some thought he was lazy. Some thought he made bad choices. A few even thought he didn't deserve help. No one ever asked him. No one knew about the job he once had. The nights he spent helping others before his life fell apart. No one knew about the way he once took care of his family. All they saw was a man sitting on the sidewalk, and that was enough for them to turn away. Still, he never let anger eat him up. It was easier to stay quiet than to explain yourself to ears that wouldn't listen. He had seen people lose themselves on the streets, their minds breaking from loneliness. He promised himself he wouldn't let that happen to him. So, he observed, he watched the flow of life as if the world was a movie and he was just sitting in the corner seat, unseen by everyone else. One cold evening, as the sky turned gray and the wind grew sharper, the street was busier than usual. Cars honked, lights flashed, and people wrapped their scarves tighter. He pulled his jacket closer and tucked his hands into the sleeves. A group of office workers walked past him, laughing loudly, not even noticing the man shivering against the wall. A mother held her child's hand and pulled her a little closer as they walked around him. A delivery driver rushed by, brushing his shoulder but not stopping. It was a normal day, and then as he looked across the street, he saw that same black car again. The young woman was in the back seat looking down at her phone. She didn't look up. She never did. Her father, the businessman, was probably somewhere inside that tall building, working late as usual. It was a world far away from the corner where he sat. At night, when the city finally slowed down, the lights from the buildings made the street glow softly. He lay down on his piece of cardboard, covering himself with his thin blanket. The ground was hard, but he was used to it. People often think being homeless is just about not having a roof. But the hardest part is being unseen. It's like shouting in a room where no one turns their head. He closed his eyes, listening to the distant sound of a train, a barking dog, and the echo of people talking as they passed. His stomach growled, but hunger was nothing new. He thought about the warm meals he once had, the smell of home-cooked food. He pushed that memory away too. Memories can be soft, but sometimes they cut deeper than anything else. The next morning, the same world greeted him again. The same footsteps, the same hurried faces. A man in a suit almost stepped on his foot and didn't even say sorry. A woman dropped a coin in his cup without looking at him. He picked up the coin, felt its cold metal against his skin, and whispered a quiet thank you. No one heard it. He noticed a little bird hopping near the trash bin across the street. It was picking up crumbs, moving fast and light. He smiled a little. The bird didn't care who he was or where he slept. It was just living, same as him. That was something. Sometimes he talked to himself softly. Not because he was losing his mind, but because silence can be heavy, and a few words can make it lighter. He told himself to keep going, to stay alert, to never give up completely. Even if the world didn't see him, he saw the world. The young woman passed by again that day, her car rolling slowly to a stop in front of the building. She was dressed in a light-colored coat, holding a book on her lap. She didn't see him, but he saw her. He always did. He noticed the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way she checked the time before stepping out of the car. She lived in a world that ran on schedules, meetings, and plans. He lived in a world that ran on survival, quiet corners, and cold nights. He didn't know then that their lives would soon cross in a way neither of them could have imagined. He didn't know that the world that ignored him would one day turn its head to see him clearly. For now he was just a man on the corner, living in the background of a city that had forgotten him. But sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the ones who end up making the biggest difference. Sometimes the quiet observer is the one who sees what others don't. And sometimes, the most unexpected person becomes the hero of a story no one saw coming. As the sun set that evening and the street grew quiet again, the man wrapped his old jacket tighter and closed his eyes, unaware that his ordinary day was the calm before something that would change everything. Not just for him, but for someone whose life was about to be saved by the man the world ignored. The next morning started like any other. The city streets were alive with footsteps, engines, and conversations, but something felt different. A sense of unease hung in the air, even though most people didn't notice it. Across town, the businessman's mansion was unusually quiet. Inside, the staff moved quickly but with tension. The young woman had not returned home the previous night. Her father, a man used to control and certainty, felt a wave of panic he rarely admitted. He called every friend, neighbor, and driver she might have been with. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. Hours passed like heavy stones in his chest. The city's news outlets picked up on the story by late morning, reporting that a wealthy man's daughter had mysteriously disappeared while returning from a charity event the night before. Social media exploded with speculations, from rumors of a runaway to worries of a kidnapping. Meanwhile, the man on the corner noticed the unusual activity around the business district. Traffic police had blocked certain streets. Journalists hovered near building entrances. The city's undercurrent of tension reached even his quiet corner. He had seen enough of the world to know that when people panic, details get lost, but instincts often do not. The previous night, he had noticed a black van parked in an alley near the charity venue. At the time, he thought little of it. Vans came and went in the city all the time. But now, with news of the disappearance, the memory came back sharply. He remembered the way the driver had kept glancing over his shoulder, the hurried movements, the shadowed faces in the back. Something about it hadn't felt right. Most people would have ignored the memory, convinced it meant nothing. He didn't. For days, the police struggled to find a lead. The staff at her school, her friends, even nearby drivers were questioned. But no one had seen anything unusual. Her phone was off, her car was gone, and the trail had gone cold. Yet the man on the corner kept observing quietly. He moved like a shadow, unnoticed and patient. He asked questions in subtle ways, watching, listening, piecing together small hints that everyone else overlooked. He discovered small clues that didn't fit the story the police were chasing. A discarded glove near the alley, tire tracks leading toward the industrial district, a light flickering in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Most people wouldn't pay attention to these things, but he did. He knew that danger often hid in plain sight, and that the smallest detail could reveal everything. As evening fell on the third day, the man made a decision. He couldn't wait for the police to find the clues. Time was slipping by too quickly, and he felt a weight in his chest, a silent pull telling him he had to act. He gathered the few things he carried with him, an old backpack with some basic supplies, a flashlight, and a worn jacket, and set off toward the industrial district. The streets grew quieter as he walked. Factories loomed like silent giants, their windows dark and dusty. The wind carried a faint smell of oil and rust. He kept to the shadows, moving carefully, listening for any sound out of place. Every footstep mattered. Every creak of metal or distant shout was a signal. He found the warehouse he had noticed earlier. Its large doors were slightly ajar, and the faint sound of voices leaked out. He crouched behind a stack of wooden crates and peered inside. There in the dim light he saw her, the young woman sitting on the floor looking frightened and confused. Two men stood nearby, arguing quietly but harshly. She was alive, but only barely holding on to hope. Fear tried to grip him, but he pushed it aside. Panic wouldn't save her. He needed a plan. He observed carefully, taking mental notes of the layout, the guards' movements, and the weak spots. He knew he couldn't rush in blindly. Most people would have called for help immediately, but he had learned over years on the street that rushing often brings danger. Patience, observation, and timing were his allies. Hours passed as he stayed hidden, watching the warehouse. Night deepened and the city lights dimmed in the distance. He considered how he might create a distraction, how he could draw the kidnapper's attention without putting her at more risk. His mind raced with scenarios, but he stayed calm. He had learned to stay calm when everything else seemed impossible. Finally, he saw an opening. One of the men stepped outside for a moment, leaving a narrow window to act. He quietly slipped closer, using crates and shadows for cover. He whispered to her to stay calm, though she couldn't see him clearly. He motioned for her to trust him. For a moment, the fear in her eyes met his determination, and a silent understanding passed between them. Though he was just a man the city ignored, he was about to become the person who mattered most. His life on the streets, the years of being unseen, had prepared him for this moment. Every instinct, every sharp observation, every bit of patience mattered now. The city might never have noticed him before, but tonight, he was about to make sure someone noticed something far more important than appearances. The night grew colder, the wind sharper, but he stayed focused. He knew the danger was real. One wrong move could end everything. Yet he did not hesitate. He had waited too long to stay silent. His courage was quiet but unwavering. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A purpose that went beyond survival. And in the distance the city slept, unaware that a man they ignored was moving toward the moment that would change everything, not just for the young woman, but for himself, and for everyone who had ever looked away. The man waited in the shadows, feeling the cold metal of the crate beneath his hands. His heart was steady, but his senses were sharper than ever. Every small sound mattered. The scrape of a boot, the faint whisper of conversation, the soft hum of the street lights filtering through the warehouse windows, all of it painted a picture in his mind. He had never been trained, never had weapons or backup, but he had something far more valuable: years of watching, learning, surviving, and understanding people. Inside, the young woman sat quietly on the dusty floor, her hands clutching her knees. She was scared but not completely hopeless.
She had noticed signs that someone had been near earlier. Strange noises, shadows flickering across the wall.
She hoped, though she barely dared to imagine, that someone would come. And now she did. The man moved carefully, avoiding the scattered tools and crates that could betray his presence. He whispered softly so she could hear, "It's okay, stay calm. I'm here to help you." Her eyes widened as she realized someone was finally there. She couldn't see him clearly, but his voice carried calm and assurance. That one sound gave her hope she hadn't felt in hours. The kidnappers argued quietly in another corner of the warehouse. One of them paced back and forth, clearly frustrated. The other leaned against a wall, checking his phone nervously. They hadn't noticed him yet, and he intended to keep it that way. He needed a distraction, something to draw one of them away without alerting the other. He looked around and spotted an old metal drum near the back of the warehouse. Carefully, he nudged it just enough to let it tip over with a loud clatter. The noise echoed through the building. One of the men cursed and ran toward the sound, leaving the young woman alone with the other. "Now," he whispered. He guided her toward the far door, keeping low and moving quickly but quietly. The other man was still distracted, investigating the noise. Every second felt like minutes, every step a test of courage and precision. The young woman's hand trembled in his, but she followed without hesitation. She sensed that this man, the one no one had ever noticed before, was her chance to escape. They moved through the shadows, passing stacks of old crates and barrels. He whispered instructions, "Stay close. Keep quiet. Don't run unless I say." She nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. She could hear the man outside growling in frustration, but she didn't dare look back. She trusted him completely. Finally, they reached a small side door. He tested it gently, found it unlocked, and signaled her to go first. She slipped through, and then he followed. The night air hit them, cold and sharp, but it was freedom. The sounds of the city felt different now, more alive, more real. They were not safe yet, but they were closer to safety than they had been for hours. As they moved toward the street, they heard shouting. The kidnappers had realized someone was missing and were coming after them. The man didn't panic. He guided her down an alley, ducking behind cars and dumpsters. Every movement was careful, every step calculated. They were almost out. Almost. A car pulled up nearby, headlights cutting through the darkness. He recognized it as a police vehicle, which he had spotted patrolling the district earlier. He waved them down silently, then ran forward, keeping the young woman behind him. The officers saw the urgency, quickly stepping out of the car. They surrounded the alley, weapons ready. The man didn't wait for thanks. He only made sure the young woman was safely inside the police car. She clung to him for a brief moment, whispering, "Thank you. Thank you so much." He nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. It wasn't for recognition, he had never cared for that. It was simply the satisfaction of knowing he had done the right thing. The kidnappers were caught soon after. They didn't expect anyone to follow their trail so quietly, so patiently. Their plan had seemed perfect, but the man's observant eyes had seen through every flaw. And now, justice was catching up to them. By the time the police finished taking statements, the city began to stir with the news. Reporters arrived, flashing cameras, recording interviews, and asking questions. Everyone wanted to know how the young woman had been rescued. But when they asked about the hero, the answer surprised them all. A man who had been ignored by the city, a man who lived on the streets, had saved her life. The young woman, wrapped in a blanket and still shaking from fear, looked up at him. Her eyes were filled with gratitude and awe. She whispered, "I can't believe you. You saved me." He only nodded again, humble as ever, brushing dust from his jacket. He didn't need fame or money. He needed only to know she was safe. People around them stared in disbelief. Some began to murmur, realizing the man they had walked past for years, the man they had ignored, had done something no one else could have done. The city had overlooked him, dismissed him, pretended he didn't exist, but he had seen, noticed and acted when it mattered most. That night, as the young woman returned home safely with her father, the man walked back to his corner. He didn't linger in the limelight. He didn't ask for recognition. He sat quietly, listening to the distant hum of the city, feeling a small warmth in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not because people applauded him, but because he had done something that mattered, something real. In the days that followed, the story spread across the city. People talked about the daring rescue, the courage it took, and the hero who had risked everything. And slowly, the man who had always been invisible began to be noticed, not just for what he had done, but for who he was. A human being who, despite being ignored for so long, had the courage to act when no one else could. He returned to his spot on the street, the corner that had been his world for so many years. But something had changed. He was no longer just the homeless man everyone passed by. He was a man who had saved a life. A man who had reminded the world that heroes often come from the most unexpected places. And for him, that was enough. The morning after the rescue, the city was buzzing in a way it rarely did. News vans lined the streets, cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions to anyone willing to answer. The story of the young woman's disappearance had gripped everyone's attention, but now the focus had shifted. A man who lived on the streets had saved her life. No one could believe it at first. People remembered passing him every day, seeing him sit quietly on the corner, and now they were hearing that he had been the hero. The millionaire father arrived at the scene shortly after. His face was a mix of relief, worry, and surprise. He had been terrified for his daughter, imagining every possible danger she might have faced. When he saw the man who had led her to safety, his emotions became even more complicated. He had always lived in a world where power, money, and control mattered, but this man had none of those things. And yet, he had saved the one person the father cared about more than anything in the world. The young woman stepped forward, wrapping her arms around the man in gratitude. Her voice was soft but steady as she said, "I don't even know how to thank you. You saved my life." He simply nodded, brushing dust from his jacket. He didn't need applause.
He didn't need recognition.
He had done what was right, and that was enough. The crowd of reporters and onlookers pressed closer, asking questions, snapping pictures, and trying to get every detail. Some people whispered in disbelief, realizing they had ignored him for years, walked past him without a glance, and yet he had done something no one else could have done. A few reporters even apologized on camera, admitting they had overlooked him just as everyone else had. The millionaire father finally spoke, his voice calm, but filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to repay you," he said. "You risked your life for my daughter, and I can never forget that." The man shrugged slightly, not used to compliments or offers of help. But the father insisted. He offered a place to stay, a job, and support for whatever the man needed. At first, the man hesitated. Pride and habit made him unsure if he deserved it. But the father's sincerity was clear. This wasn't just a reward, it was a chance for a new life. Meanwhile, the young woman told her story to the police and reporters, her voice shaking as she described the fear she had felt and the courage of the man who had saved her. She spoke of his calmness, his intelligence, and the way he had guided her through danger without hesitation. Everyone listening realized that the hero was someone who had nothing to gain personally, someone who had acted purely out of instinct and kindness. As the story spread, people who had once ignored him began to notice him in a new way. Neighbors remembered passing by him and feeling nothing. Coworkers at nearby offices remembered seeing him every day and now felt ashamed. Children who had once avoided looking at him stared with curiosity and admiration. The world had overlooked him, but his courage had reminded everyone that true bravery doesn't come from wealth, status, or appearance. It comes from heart and action. The man accepted the father's offer slowly. He wasn't used to being treated with respect or given choices. He had lived for so long in a world where no one noticed him that the attention felt strange, almost uncomfortable. But he realized he could finally have stability, a chance to rebuild, and the ability to live with dignity. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about being given the chance to live fully again. Over the next few days, the young woman visited him often, bringing warm meals, clothes, and stories of her life. They didn't speak much about money or rewards. It wasn't necessary. They spoke about ordinary things, books, city life, and small moments that made life meaningful. He listened quietly, learning about a world he had only observed from a distance, while she learned about the strength, courage, and humanity of someone she had once walked past without noticing. The media continued to cover the story, but the man never sought the spotlight. He had done what he had to do because it was right, not for fame. But the world noticed him anyway. People shared his story, and many were inspired to rethink how they treated others, especially those who seemed invisible. The story became a reminder that heroism can come from anyone, even someone society forgets or overlooks. At night, he returned to his old corner for a brief moment, the place he had called home for so many years. The city lights reflected off the pavement, and he felt a quiet sense of peace. He had been invisible for so long, but now he had been seen, not for what he lacked, but for what he was capable of. Courage, compassion, and strength had no price tags, no addresses, and no appearances. That night, as he rested, he realized something important. He hadn't just saved a life. He had reminded the world that every life, no matter how small or overlooked, mattered. The millionaire father made sure the man had everything he needed. He provided a small apartment, steady work, and support to help him reintegrate into society. But more than that, he offered friendship and trust, something the man had rarely experienced. Slowly, he began to adjust to a new life, a life where people saw him for who he was, not what they assumed about him. Through it all, the young woman never forgot his bravery. She spoke about him often, praising his courage, humility, and quick thinking. Their bond grew quietly, rooted in gratitude and mutual respect. And the man, who had once been invisible to everyone, finally felt that he belonged somewhere, not because he had wealth or status, but because he had shown that kindness and courage could shine brighter than fear and neglect. The city began to remember him differently. Children pointed him out to their parents, strangers smiled as they passed, and neighbors greeted him warmly. The story of a homeless man saving a millionaire's daughter became more than a news headline. It became a lesson in humanity. And though he never sought recognition, the world had finally acknowledged what he had always known, that courage, kindness, and heart could not be ignored. Life slowly began to change for the man. He no longer had to sit on a cold street corner each day, waiting for scraps or the passing kindness of strangers. The apartment the millionaire provided was small but warm and safe. For the first time in years, he had a place to rest without fear. He had a job that allowed him to feel useful again, not as someone just surviving, but as someone contributing, someone respected. At first, the routine felt strange. The noises of the city were different from the constant hum he had grown used to on the streets. The walls were smooth and clean, and the bed didn't complain beneath him. He sometimes touched the furniture as if to make sure it was real. Small comforts, things many people took for granted, now felt extraordinary. A hot meal without having to scavenge. Clean clothes that didn't carry the smell of the street. These were luxuries he had never thought he would experience again. Yet even with all this, the man remained humble. He never flaunted the help he received. He didn't ask for recognition or attention. His courage had been born out of necessity and compassion, not for fame. When reporters or curious neighbors asked how he felt, he simply said, "I just did what anyone should do." People who had ignored him before were struck by his humility. They realized that heroism could be quiet and unassuming, and that true strength didn't need applause. The young woman visited often, bringing warmth and stories of her life. She never treated him like a charity case, and he never felt pitied. Instead, they shared conversations about ordinary things: books, food, the city, and small dreams for the future. Over time, a bond grew between them, built on gratitude, trust, and respect. She had learned that bravery and kindness could come from anyone, even someone society dismissed, and he had learned that some people, even in wealthy worlds, could be genuinely good and understanding. The city began to take notice of his story. It was no longer just news about a rescue. It became an example of humanity, courage, and the power of one person to make a difference. Schools spoke about him as a lesson in empathy. Neighbors started treating those on the streets with more respect. People shared his story not because he was rich or famous, but because he had done the right thing when no one else would. Even as his life improved, he never forgot where he had come from. He sometimes walked past his old corner, remembering the years of being unseen. Those memories were painful but also grounding. They reminded him why he had acted when he did, why he had chosen courage over silence, and why small acts of attention and care mattered so much. He had learned that being invisible didn't mean being powerless. The millionaire father often checked in on him, not as a boss, but as someone who wanted to ensure he was adjusting well. Their relationship was respectful and warm. The father had learned an important lesson too, that wealth and power cannot replace courage, integrity, and compassion. The man had saved the one person he loved most, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone around him of what truly mattered. Over time, the man began to help others in his own way. He volunteered quietly, helping people who were struggling on the streets, sharing advice and encouragement. His life experience gave him insight and empathy that few could understand. He had once been ignored, overlooked, and forgotten, and now he made it a point to notice, listen, and help. In a way, the cycle had reversed. The world had once overlooked him, and now he became the eyes and hands of help for others. Years later, people would remember the story not just as a rescue, but as a reminder of the value of every life. They would speak of a man who had once been invisible, who had saved a life and, in doing so, changed the hearts of a city. A man who showed that courage and compassion can be found in the most unexpected places, The man had started as someone the world ignored. But in saving a life, he became someone the world could never forget. His bravery, humility, and kindness left a lasting impact, proving that heroes do not always wear uniforms, live in mansions, or command attention. Sometimes they sit quietly, on a street corner watching, waiting, and when the moment comes, they act. And in that act, they change everything. And so he lived a life with purpose again, not defined by his past or by what others thought of him, but by the courage and kindness he carried in his heart. The city that had ignored him learned a lesson it would never forget. Every person matters, and sometimes the ones we overlook have the power to save us all. Years passed, and the man's story became more than just a headline. It became a lesson that lived in the hearts of the city. People still remembered the day he saved the young woman, but what stayed even longer was how he changed the way the city looked at its most overlooked citizens. Neighborhoods began noticing the people who once went ignored. Shopkeepers stopped shooing away street dwellers. Children who once whispered or laughed at someone sitting on a corner learned to greet, share, and help. Schools began telling his story as an example of courage and humanity, teaching that anyone, no matter their circumstances, can make a difference. Local charities and organizations grew stronger because of him. Inspired by the man who had acted when no one else would, volunteers dedicated more time to helping those in need. Funds were raised for shelters, warm meals, and education programs. Slowly, the city became a little kinder, a little more aware, and a little more human. The young woman often spoke about him even years later. She had grown into a thoughtful, caring adult, one determined to use her influence to make the world better. She credited the man not just for saving her life, but for showing her what real courage and selflessness looked like. She started programs to support the homeless and give them opportunities, always remembering the man who had been invisible to the world until that one brave night. For the man himself, life continued quietly but with purpose. He worked with organizations to help others who were struggling, sharing his experience and wisdom. People listened when he spoke, because he had lived the lessons he shared. He remained humble, never forgetting the long years of being unseen, but his presence became a reminder that every life, no matter how small or overlooked, had value. His story traveled beyond the city. Newspapers, websites, and social media shared his journey of courage, kindness, and redemption. People around the country, and even in other parts of the world, were inspired to look at their communities differently, to notice those who often went unseen, and to remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. In time, the man who had once been ignored by everyone became a symbol of hope. Not because he wanted recognition, but because his actions had shown that bravery and compassion are stronger than fear, stronger than judgment, and stronger than wealth or status. The city he lived in learned a lasting truth. Sometimes the quietest voices, the ones the world overlooks, are the ones who teach us the most about humanity. And so, his life became more than a rescue story. It became a movement, a reminder that every person has the power to make a difference, that every act of courage can ripple far beyond a single moment, and that kindness and bravery can change the world in ways no one ever expects. Years after the rescue, the man's life had transformed in ways he had never imagined. The streets that had once been his world were now a distant memory, yet the lessons of those years stayed with him. Every morning, he woke up in his small apartment, sunlight spilling through the windows, and he felt a quiet gratitude for the life he had been given. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was real, and it was his. He had grown accustomed to routines he had never known before. He cooked his own meals, learned to manage money, and started saving a little each month. These were small accomplishments to most people, but to him they were milestones. They represented independence, stability, and dignity, things he had gone without for far too long. And yet, even with these comforts, he never forgot where he had come from. He often visited shelters and community centers, not as a guest or a celebrity, but as someone who understood the struggles of the people he met. He listened more than he spoke, offering guidance born from lived experience. A young man who had been on the streets for months confided in him, and the man shared practical advice about surviving while keeping hope alive. A young woman struggling with despair found comfort in his calm presence. He didn't hand out judgment or pity. He shared understanding, and that made all the difference. Word of his involvement spread. Schools invited him to speak to children about courage, empathy, and perseverance. Teachers would introduce him by saying, "This is a man who taught the city that every life matters." When he spoke, he didn't use fancy words or dramatic stories. He spoke simply about noticing people, about small acts of kindness, and about courage even when no one is watching. His words carried weight because he had lived them. Children listened, wide-eyed, not just to learn a story but to understand the value of empathy in their own lives. The young woman he had saved remained a constant presence in his life. She had grown into a remarkable woman, leading philanthropic projects, funding programs for the homeless, and mentoring young adults in need. She often invited him to help design these programs. He never demanded recognition, but he contributed quietly, offering insights no one else could provide. Together, they created initiatives that gave people a chance to rebuild, shelters that focused on education and skill building, programs that provided mental health support, and outreach that reminded people they were seen. The millionaire father also stayed in touch, though their relationship was simple and respectful. He sometimes offered advice or support, but mostly, he wanted the man to feel comfortable in a life that had been so different from the one he once had. Over time, he noticed the profound impact the man had not just on his daughter, but on the community as a whole. The father began to fund similar initiatives in other cities, inspired by the simple courage of a man who had no wealth but had more heart than many who did. The man also took time to reflect on his own journey. He sometimes walked through parts of the city he had once called home, watching the people who moved too fast to notice others. He would smile at the small acts of kindness he observed, a stranger handing a cup of coffee to someone sitting on a bench, a child offering a flower to a street performer. These moments reminded him that change was happening, even if slowly. His own story had sparked ripples in the city, and those ripples continued to grow. He became particularly involved with a project to train former homeless people in useful skills so they could find work. He knew firsthand that survival was one thing, but rebuilding a life required confidence, opportunity, and belief. He taught patience and observation, showing them how to notice opportunities and avoid danger. But he also emphasized dignity and self-respect. "Your past does not define you," he would tell them. "Your courage and choices define who you are." Many of the people he helped eventually found jobs, moved into apartments, and regained their independence. They often returned to thank him, but he always reminded them, "You did this yourself. I only showed you the way." Despite all the change in his life, he remained humble. He never sought fame, never asked for accolades, and never let the past make him bitter. Instead, he used his story as a bridge to connect with people who had been forgotten or ignored. He understood better than anyone that courage wasn't about applause. It was about doing the right thing even when no one is watching. And he had spent enough years watching to know that small acts of courage can have huge consequences. Over time, his story spread beyond the city. Newspapers, websites, and television programs shared his journey from a homeless man to a community hero. People around the world were inspired by him, not because he was wealthy or powerful, but because he had acted with bravery, compassion, and humility. Schools across the country invited him to speak, and many of his speeches were shared online, reaching thousands who had never even been to his city.